In 1969, something sinister was going on at Baltimore's all-girls Archbishop Keough High School. Many of the students knew what was happening inside the chaplain's office, but they didn't dare talk about it openly. And every time the announcement blared from the loudspeaker for so-and-so to report to the chaplain, classrooms fell silent as girl after girl reported for what was usually referred to as counseling. One girl was so terrified that she tried to hide in the stairwell. It wasn't long before Father Neil Magnus found her huddled in a corner and escorted her to the office of Father Joseph Maskell. And when the door clicked shut, the abuse began. The nuns who ran the school as both teachers and administrators most likely knew, or at least strongly suspected, that Father Maskell and Father Magnus were sexually abusing students at Archbishop Keough. But the nuns were all too afraid to speak up. All but one, that is. 26-year-old Sister Cathy Cesnik stood out among the nuns at the school. She was young, beautiful, kind, and above all, she was compassionate. Students gravitated toward her because she made them feel like they mattered. And to Sister Cathy, they did matter, every last one of them. And when one of her students very reluctantly revealed that the two priests at the school were sexually abusing her, Sister Cathy decided that something needed to be done. She looked the girl in the eye and told her, "I'm going to take care of this." 7 months later, Sister Cathy turned up dead. My name is Michael, and this is the story of the murder of Sister Cathy Cesnik and how her case played a part in exposing 156 Baltimore priests as pedophiles. Now, if you've already seen The Keepers, a 2017 Netflix documentary, you know all about Sister Cathy. But in this video, we'll also be looking at the jaw-dropping Maryland Attorney General's report on sex abuse in Baltimore's Catholic churches, which was released in 2023. And it includes details on the priests who were not seen in The Keepers, but were directly connected to a key figure in the documentary. The newspaper article from my thumbnail is available at grimsilence.com, and I've also included links to the reports on church sex abuse from both Pennsylvania and Maryland. And if you like my particular brand of true crime, please be sure to like and subscribe. Before getting into the details of the murder of Sister Cathy, it is important to understand exactly what was happening at Archbishop Keough High School. To put the time period in perspective, 1969 was the year of Woodstock, Easy Rider, and the moon landing. 1969 was also one of several years during which Archbishop Keough High School had not one, but two sexual predators on its staff. One of them was Father Neil Magnus. And by the way, I'm only using the title of father to emphasize what he was supposed to be to the girls at Keough and what they believed he represented. And to illustrate that belief for the uninitiated, this is a quote from one of the hundreds of victims cited in the Maryland AG report. "I believed God was here on earth in the form of our parish priest. He could do no harm. His words and deeds could and would be considered from God." Yes, the parish priest was God on earth. What Father Magnus did to students at Archbishop Keough is described in excruciating detail by the victims themselves in The Keepers, that Netflix documentary. But for those who haven't seen the documentary, suffice it to say that Father Magnus was, to put it mildly, a monster in priest's clothing. The same was true of Father Joseph Maskell, Archbishop Keough's other resident sexual predator. Magnus and Maskell were both in the habit of drugging their victims, and they also used Catholicism as a weapon to coerce and control the girls at Keough. In fact, the AG report confirms that this was a common tactic among many of the accused Baltimore priests. Priests would tell their victims that the abuse was God's will, that God would not mind, and this last quote is particularly disgusting. "If you do this, you'll be closer to God." And what Magnus and Maskell told Keough students was even more atrocious and offensive. Many priests also warned their victims that there would be grave consequences for telling their parents about the abuse. One priest threatened a boy with castration, another threatened an eternity in hell for the victim or the victim's family, and Maskell himself told girls that their parents would lose their jobs and the girls would be sent to foster homes. Following a pattern that is seen in many clergy sex abuse cases, Magnus and Maskell carefully identified the most vulnerable students at Keough. They targeted children who lacked confidence, children who had been abused before, children who were especially devoted to the church, and the list goes on. And then, the two priests at Archbishop Keough subjected the girls to sexual atrocities that will not be described here. And based on numbers alone, Maskell was by far the worst of the two offenders. To date, Maskell has been accused by at least 39 victims, many of them Keough students. As the school's chaplain and counselor in 1969, Maskell was in a position to call students to his office on any day, at any time, and nobody would question why. His office was located in a far corner of the school, and, very conveniently, his office had a door to the outside through which Maskell's pedophile friends could quietly enter and exit. Victims at Keough were R-worded by not only Maskell and Magnus, but other men as well. The other men included police officers, priests from local parishes, and other members of the community the girls had grown up believing they should trust and obey. Maskell, Magnus, and their child-abusing buddies brazenly R-worded girl after girl with impunity. Like many nuns at Archbishop Keough, Sister Cathy strongly suspected that girls were being sexually abused at the school, but she couldn't just make an accusation on a hunch. But Jean Hargadon, later known by her married name of Jean Wehner, very reluctantly let Sister Cathy know that she was being sexually abused by the priests. She gave Sister Cathy something to go on. It is unknown exactly what Sister Cathy did next. Did she launch her own investigation and start questioning other girls at the school? Did she directly confront Father Magnus and Father Maskell? Did she go straight to the Archdiocese of Baltimore and demand action? To the best of my knowledge, nobody knows, or at least nobody is willing to say. But word had somehow gotten back to Father Maskell that at least one girl was talking. It's unclear whether he knew it was Jean Hargadon or just strongly suspected her, but he confronted her in a way that scared her into silence for over 20 years. The girl was legitimately afraid that Maskell would kill her. More on that in a bit. By the fall semester of 1969, Sister Cathy and her good friend, Sister Russell Phillips, had left Archbishop Keough to teach in Baltimore's public school system. They were still nuns, still part of their order, but they traded in their habits for more modern attire and moved into an apartment together. It is believed that their departure had something to do with the abuse that was taking place at the school, but the public reason given was that the nuns were doing some sort of experiment by going outside of the Archdiocese. On the night of Friday, November 7th, Sister Cathy Cesnik had some errands to run. She needed to stop at the bank, pick up some buns at the local bakery, and then she was going to buy a gift for her sister who had recently gotten engaged. Sister Cathy left her home at the Carriage House Apartments at about 7 p.m., and she drove to the Edmondson Village Shopping Center in Baltimore. Later that night, the nun's roommate, Sister Russell, was starting to get worried. It was approaching midnight, and Sister Cathy still had not come home. Sister Russell called police shortly before 1 a.m. to report the woman missing. Sister Russell also called two good friends that night, Brother Peter McKeon and Reverend Gerard Keough, or Jerry Keough as he is known in the Netflix documentary. The two men had gone to the apartment to be supportive and talk things through with Sister Russell, and much has been made of Keough's relationship with Sister Cathy. The two were dating at the time, but the nun and the Reverend were not sexually involved. After the police had come and gone, McKeon and Keough stepped outside for a short walk. It was the middle of the night, past 4 a.m., and the two men spotted something strange. It was Sister Cathy's car, a green 1969 Ford Maverick. and it was parked on a side street across from the carriage house parking lot, its rear blocking the sidewalk and jutting out into the street. The tires were muddy, the doors were unlocked, and there was a twig hanging from the turn signal. Keough described the twig as having been tied to the turn signal as if someone had put it there intentionally. It seemed highly unlikely that Sister Cathy had parked this car herself. There was no way she would have parked so carelessly across the street from the carriage house parking lot where she always parked her car, and she would have locked the doors. Sister Cathy had left the carriage house apartments alone in her car, and it appeared that someone else had brought the car back. Authorities quickly assembled search teams to look for the missing nun. 35 police officers and 5 search dog teams covered every inch of a 14-block area of southwest Baltimore. Officers knocked on doors, checked alleyways, and searched abandoned buildings in the area. The search went on for 3 days. There was no sign of Sister Cathy anywhere. With very little to go on, police were quickly heading toward a dead end less than a week into the investigation, and within days after Sister Cathy had gone missing, news of another young woman's disappearance began appearing alongside news relating to Sister Cathy. The disappearance of 20-year-old Joyce Malecki shared some similarities with the Sister Cathy case. Both women were young and beautiful. Both had gone out shopping before they vanished. Both drove cars that were found unlocked and abandoned in unusual places, with Malecki's car being found near a payphone in a gas station parking lot. And both women were found dead in obscure, out-of-the-way locations. The body of Joyce Malecki was found just 2 days after she went missing. She was discovered face down in the Little Patuxent River near Fort Meade, an Army base located about 30 minutes south of Baltimore. She was fully clothed and her hands were tied behind her back. The young woman had been strangled to death. Sister Cathy's remains would not be located until January 3rd, nearly 2 months after she disappeared. A father and son came across her badly decomposed body in what was widely reported to be a trash dump. The nun's body was only partially clothed, suggesting that she may have been sexually assaulted. A medical examiner determined that she had been choked and hit in the head with a blunt object. Police were quick to dismiss any link between the Joyce Malecki case and that of Sister Cathy. The two women did not appear to have ever met, and they had no mutual friends that anyone knew of. But unbeknownst to police at the time, Joyce Malecki and Sister Cathy did have one mutual acquaintance that would raise questions 48 years later on Netflix. That acquaintance was Father Joseph Maskell. Malecki's family once attended St. Clement's Church, where Maskell was an assistant pastor before he got transferred to Archbishop Keough High School. So it is entirely possible that Joyce Malecki was acquainted with Father Joseph Maskell. The murders of both Sister Cathy Cesnik and Joyce Malecki went unsolved, and as decades passed, it seemed that everyone had forgotten all about the murder of Sister Cathy and the years of horrifying abuse that had taken place at Archbishop Keough High School. But in 1992, a 41-year-old woman came forward with bombshell allegations of sexual abuse that not only named her tormentors, one of whom was Father Maskell, but she also directly implicated Maskell in the murder of Sister Cathy Cesnik. This woman was a student at the high school in 1969. This woman was Jean Wehner, the girl who had been threatened by Father Maskell all those years before and who had told Sister Cathy about the abuse. At first, these allegations in 1992 received little to no attention in the press. But when a $40 million lawsuit was filed against the Archdiocese of Baltimore in 1994, Maskell was suddenly making headlines. The 55-year-old priest maintained his innocence, saying, "I was in shock. I never had sex with a kid." Friends also came to his defense. Retired Baltimore County Police Captain James Skinnell, who made an appearance in the Netflix documentary, spoke of how Maskell had baptized his children, how his children liked the priest, and how Scannell, being a cop, would have noticed if Maskell was a sex criminal, his logic being that police would have noticed, as if they have some kind of spidey sense, and bells would have gone off. A Baltimore City councilman called Maskell a priest's priest, which probably sounded like a compliment at the time, but in retrospect, that was an extremely poor choice of words. The Reverend Robert Hoskins called the accusations against Maskell absurd, saying he was a fine man. And Attilia Marassa, who worked at Archbishop Keough during Maskell's reign of terror there, was resolute in her defense of the disgraced priest. I think Father Maskell is above reproach, an upstanding priest. All this crap that's coming out about priests is just to get money from the Catholic Church. If it had happened to me, it would have been reported at once. You can bet your bippy on that. I would have gone right away to the Archdiocese. Don't wait 25 years. The girls should have told their parents right away and gotten a lawyer and reported to the Archdiocese. Maskell had his defenders, but that handful of voices was quickly drowned out by the growing number of former Keough students who were coming forward, and the cold case of Sister Cathy, the nun who may have died trying to stop Maskell, was once again in the public eye. Despite the renewed attention from police and new tips being called in, the murder of Sister Cathy would continue to remain a mystery. Jean Wehner, who had confided in Sister Cathy all those years earlier, did, in 1994, publicly tell her story of how she knew that Father Maskell was somehow involved in Sister Cathy's murder. Wehner described how Maskell took her to see Sister Cathy's dead body, and how Maskell said she had better keep quiet about what he was doing to her behind closed doors, the implication being that she would also end up dead if she didn't keep her mouth shut. But the allegation alone wasn't enough to arrest the priest for murder. There were also allegations of a police cover-up. Remember, Maskell had been inviting police officers to his office at Archbishop Keough High School to participate in R-wording students. 25 years later, it is quite possible that some of those officers may have risen through the ranks and, by 1994, were in a position to make sure that any new evidence that was unearthed would never see the light of day. By 2012, a little grassroots investigation into Sister Cathy's murder had gotten underway, led by a trio of determined retirees: journalist Tom Nugent, nurse Abbie Schaub, and teacher Gemma Hoskins. Schaub and Hoskins, former Archbishop Keough students themselves, remember Sister Cathy with great fondness, and they both serve a major role in the Keepers as guides into that tragically dark era at Archbishop Keough. A little over a year after The Keepers was released on Netflix in May of 2017, a scathing grand jury report identified 301 priests who had victimized over 1,000 children, not in Maryland, but in Pennsylvania. And even though we're talking about a different state here, the report describes the actions of the Archdiocese of Baltimore with stunning accuracy. The Pennsylvania report details what one newspaper called a blueprint for cover-up, and the blueprint in the report describes 7 tried-and-true church strategies for sweeping clergy sex abuse under the rug. The 7 strategies, paraphrased by law enforcement and written from the perspective of the church, are as follows. First, make sure to use euphemisms rather than real words to describe the sexual assaults in diocese documents. Never say rape. Say inappropriate contact or boundary issues. Second, don't conduct genuine investigations with properly trained personnel. Instead, assign fellow clergy members to ask inadequate questions and then make credibility determinations about the colleagues with whom they live and work. Third, for an appearance of integrity, send priests for evaluation at church-run psychiatric treatment centers. Allow these experts to diagnose whether the priest was a pedophile based largely on the priest's self-reports and regardless of whether the priest had actually engaged in sexual contact with a child. Fourth, when a priest does have to be removed, don't say why. tell his parishioners that he is on sick leave or suffering from nervous exhaustion, or say nothing at all. Fifth, even if a priest is raping children, keep providing him housing and living expenses, although he may be using these resources to facilitate more sexual assaults. Sixth, if a predator's conduct becomes known to the community, don't remove him from the priesthood to ensure that no more children will be victimized. Instead, transfer him to a new location where no one will know he is a child abuser. Finally, and above all, don't tell the police. Child sex abuse, even short of actual penetration, is and has for all relevant times been a crime. But don't treat it that way. Handle it like a personnel matter, in-house. While the murder of Sister Cathy wasn't directly responsible for the state of Maryland publishing its own report on sex abuse in the church, it certainly set the stage by inspiring a documentary that, by now, has been seen by untold millions. In 2024 alone, over 6 years after the documentary was released, The Keepers was streamed on Netflix roughly 1.2 million times. The Pennsylvania grand jury report was released in August of 2018, and almost immediately, the Maryland Attorney General's office was asking the public for reports of abuse that were, quote, associated with a school or place of worship. To nobody's surprise, completing the investigation and releasing the report took much longer than expected. It was originally supposed to include churches from 3 different regions, but it ended up focusing entirely on the Archdiocese of Baltimore. When the report finally dropped in 2023, it spanned 80 years of abuse, torture, and cover-ups, nearly all of which followed the Pennsylvania blueprint to the letter. The following is a brief overview taken directly from the Maryland Attorney General's report. The sheer number of abusers and victims, the depravity of the abuser's conduct, and the frequency with which known abusers were given the opportunity to continue preying upon children are astonishing. Over 600 children are known to have been abused by the 156 people included in this report, but the number is likely far higher. The ways in which abusers preyed upon their victims varied widely, but all took advantage of the position of authority and respect afforded priests and other clergy in Catholic communities. The duration and scope of the abuse perpetrated by Catholic clergy was only possible because of the complicity of those charged with leading the church and protecting its faithful. They focused not on protecting victims or stopping the abuse, but rather on ensuring at all costs that the abuse be kept hidden. The costs and consequences of avoiding scandal were borne by the victimized children. It's not really practical for this video to discuss all 156 priests in the AG report, 2 of whom are actually nuns, not priests. So let's take a brief look at the ones who have direct ties to Father Maskell. There are 7. One of them is Father Magnus, and his crimes are well documented in The Keepers, so I think we can leave his story for the documentary to tell. In 1997, a woman reported that she had been sexually abused by Father Joseph Keough between 1967 and 1972. The woman was a teenager at the time, and she did report the abuse to a number of people. And in a stroke of horrible irony, 2 of the people she reported the abuse to were Father Maskell and Father Magnus, suggesting that this girl may have been a student at Keough. The part of Father Keough's report that deals with Maskell and Magnus is partially redacted, so it's hard to say what went on there. But as we know, other priests were frequently invited to the chaplain's office at Keough, and Keough may have been one of them. But the AG report does not state that Keough was accused of R-wording any Keough students. Father William Sims is accused of sexually abusing a number of little boys, many of them altar boys, across decades, dating back to the 1950s, while he was still in seminary studying to be a priest. That should have been a red flag that maybe this guy shouldn't have been allowed into the priesthood, but he was, and many children paid the price. The link between Sims and Maskell in 1969 is a bit indirect, but I think it's very much worth mentioning that Sims was a chaplain for the Baltimore County Police and Fire Departments around the same time that Maskell held similar positions with Baltimore police. And seeing from the AG report how these predators managed to find each other and victimize children together, it is entirely likely that Sims and Maskell were aware of their shared interests. The AG report states that Sims maintained contact with other sex abusers in the Archdiocese, although Maskell is not named as one of them. However, Sims did live with Maskell and fellow sex offender Father John Carney in the 1980s. Also, in a strange twist of fate, a man who reported abuse in 2002 initially believed that he had been abused by Sims in 1957 at a church summer camp. But then, the man concluded that it was actually Maskell who had abused him. One of the other priests connected to Maskell is Father John Joseph Mike. Based on his assignment history, this child molester seems unlikely to have had any involvement in the abuse at Archbishop Keough, but he was known to Maskell in the 1980s. Father Mike had been torturing and sexually abusing young boys, and apparently Maskell was Father Mike's counselor, which is ironic, almost comically so. As Father Mike's counselor, Maskell was aware of at least one victim of Father Mike's, and in keeping with the Pennsylvania Church blueprint, Maskell didn't report the abuse and told the Archdiocese that what Mike did to that teenage boy was an isolated incident, which it most certainly was not. Father Mike was then transferred to a new parish. In 1988, the Archdiocese of Baltimore continued to follow the Pennsylvania blueprint perfectly by placing Father Mike on extended leave of absence, during which he would continue to receive a salary along with car and health insurance coverage. Father Maskell left Archbishop Keough High School in 1975 and was succeeded as chaplain by another pedophile, Father Brian Cox. Cox is one of just a handful of the 156 sex offenders in the AG report who actually served time in prison. He did 9 months behind bars after sexually assaulting a number of boys, mostly in the 1980s. But the fact that he started working at Keough around the time that Maskell left means that they could have known each other in 1969 when Sister Cathy was murdered and the students of Keough were being R-worded on a regular basis. According to the AG report, Cox had a preference for boys, but that doesn't automatically mean that he never sexually abused any girls. Father Maskell himself had been abusing boys at Sacred Heart of Mary, St. Clement, and Our Lady of Victory, which is what led him to be transferred to Archbishop Keough. Father John Peacock was a pastor at Our Lady of Victory from 1952 to 1973, a period during which Father Maskell also served at that parish for about 2 years. Peacock is accused of abusing a 4th-grade girl at Our Lady of Victory in the 1960s, and the victim believes that other priests were involved as well, one of them being Father John Carney, who served at Our Lady of Victory throughout most of the 60s and 70s, and remember, John Carney is also the one who was roommates with Sims and Maskell. Maskell would later victimize this girl when she was a student at Keough. And finally, we have Father John Carney. From 1968 to 1970, Carney and Maskell were both assigned to Our Lady of Victory, right around the time that Maskell would be transferred to Archbishop Keough. And Carney had actually been a teacher at Keough in 1965 when the school first opened, but there's no word on why he left. However, the AG report does say that a woman reported that Carney was present on at least one occasion when Maskell was sexually abusing her. This indicates that Carney was almost certainly one of the priests Maskell had invited to his office at Keough. And on top of that, Carney and Maskell were apparently very good friends. They were such good friends that after Jean Wehner came forward in 1992 to report the abuse Maskell had subjected her to, Carney said that Maskell had admitted to him that the allegations were true. Out of the 156 clergy sex abusers in the AG report, Father Joseph Maskell has to be among the worst of them, and probably one of the most prolific. He victimized dozens of children that we know of over the course of his 30 or so years as a priest, and it seems highly likely that he preyed on more victims when he went to Ireland to work as a psychologist. And despite his lifetime of R-wording young children, Maskell died in 2001 without ever having been charged with a crime. Magnus died in 1988, also before justice could catch up to him. As for the big question of whether Maskell was involved in the murder of Sister Cathy, my personal belief is yes. I believe Jean Wehner. There may not be any physical evidence implicating Maskell, but Wehner's account makes it hard to believe that he wasn't a part of it. The public release of the AG report of 2023 is a big achievement, and an enormous amount of credit belongs to Jean Wehner, Teresa Lancaster, and many others who worked hard to make that happen. Lancaster is also a Keough victim, and she joined Wehner in 1994 as they filed a $40 million lawsuit against the Archdiocese. The case was dismissed on the grounds of the statute of limitations having expired. But that defeat eventually led to a huge victory. Less than a week after the AG report was released in 2023, Maryland Governor Wes Moore signed the Child Victims Act, which eliminates the statute of limitations on civil lawsuits like the one that Wehner and Lancaster filed in 1994. I reached out to Abbie Schaub on social media to ask if Wehner and Lancaster could revive their lawsuit, and Schaub was kind enough to explain that, unfortunately, they cannot. Despite the victories of the AG report and the Child Victims Act, battles are still being fought with the Archdiocese of Baltimore even today. Just before the Child Victims Act was passed, the Archdiocese of Baltimore filed for bankruptcy, a move that forced all victims of abuse to sue the church in bankruptcy court by the end of May 2024. Anyone who was abused by Baltimore priests before the bankruptcy but did not sue by the deadline is now out of luck. In the murder case of Sister Cathy, it seems unlikely that that will be solved anytime soon, but Abbie Schaub and Gemma Hoskins are working on it. And the Joyce Malecki case is currently being looked at by the FBI. Malecki's body was exhumed in December of 2023 with the hopes of discovering DNA evidence that could not be obtained in 1969. To date, no further updates have been given. Although the murders of Sister Cathy and Joyce Malecki remain unsolved, in a certain way, I think Sister Cathy did keep her promise to Jean Wehner when she was a teenage girl at Archbishop Keough. In death, Sister Cathy is helping to draw the attention of people like Schaub and Hoskins, filmmakers like Ryan White, who directed The Keepers, and perhaps most importantly, people like you, the viewer, and the attention that you give to documentaries, news stories, and even YouTube videos like this one. It may have taken decades for the Archdiocese of Baltimore to acknowledge the rampant abuse in their churches and schools, but hopefully they will now work to prevent future abuses and immediately hand pedophiles over to the authorities. That would, after all, be the Christian thing to do. Deepest sympathies to all of the victims in this horrifying tale, and I wish the best to Abbie Schaub and Gemma Hoskins as they continue their investigation. Please leave your thoughts down below, check out The Keepers on Netflix if you haven't already, and thank you for watching.